my big pleasure to call on stage Richard Youngman from the Cleantech Group. Come here. I don't need to present you because you're already very famous. And here's your clicker.
Thank you, Jan. So Jan, I think it was 3 years ago I was supposed to be your opening speaker at your opening event, and I apologize that personal circumstances made me let you down that day, and I'm sorry it's taken 3 years to rectify it, but thank you for having me this morning. So I'd like to spend my time picking up the story that Alois told and sort of tell a few other bits of it, if you like, from my own perspective at the Cleantech Group, and I'm going to try and spend most of my time looking forward, because I do honestly believe that there are companies already out there who are part of what I'm describing as the third wave. But I think it's important to start by looking back on a couple of things, because I need to explain to you what the other two waves were if I'm going to try and convince you there's a third wave, and I want to try and emphasize what we mean by clean tech, even if you might use it or other people might use it in different ways. And one way is brought home by this email that was sent to a colleague of mine in March saying he was not going to come to the forum in San Francisco because effectively clean tech is dead. It's over. And essentially the argument seems to be that technology has allowed the oil and gas industry to keep going, to find new resources of energy. Energy is going to be bountiful, therefore there is no need for clean tech. The second aspect people overly concentrate on is this so-called boom and bust, or rise of investment, fall of investment. This has been going on for centuries in investment, essentially corrections, ups and downs. And so what you're seeing here is the rise of venture investment into so-called clean tech companies in Europe and Israel that falls off 2011, 2012. I suspect it may even fall off again in 2013. That does not mean it's not going to rise again. And I think, again, recent history around the internet will tell us that we can't write it off just because we've reached one peak of investment activity. Overhyped maybe, healthy correction maybe. However, the internet has been one of the most powerful innovating forces and one of the most powerful productivity forces we've ever seen in the last few years, 5 years on after people wrote it off around 2000. I want to go back to the basics of sort of at least what we think of as clean tech. It's not an industry, it's a theme, it's an idea. It's the idea of more with less, of using any type of resources with more productivity, both economically and less damage on the environment. And it deliberately, in the founder's eyes, sort of used an incredible array of different areas. So at the top, you're looking at the 18 different ways we categorize companies, and then we go into hundreds of subcategories. My point is not to sort of go into every one. My point is to say that given the portfolio of activity, given the industries and the applications and the geographies that all these companies are taking on, there is no way that clean tech can be dead. There can be suffering parts within this world and this portfolio, but the whole thing, surely, when we are trying to do more with less, which is an ever-ending process, it can never be so. I want to look at the public market index with a different point to actually re-emphasize that this is not clean energy, which is essentially what the email effectively, to me at least, said. And to show that, I think simply just look at our own Cleantech Index versus clean energy indices. They are an overlapping set of companies, but they are broadly different. Because when we look at clean tech, we are looking at the world of agri, we're looking at water, we're looking at energy efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. And its outperformance the last 4 years just says they're different. It doesn't say it's better, it doesn't say what's going to happen in the future. It just reminds us that this innovation theme is different. So broadly speaking, very quickly, just to get to wave 3, wave 1 to us is some sort of period that Alois has very much sort of experienced, which is kind of the world in when really people didn't even call it clean tech. They didn't necessarily think of it in those terms, and indeed there weren't that many investors and companies. Prior to this uplift around 2005, which is essentially fundraising to invest in such companies. That inevitably leads to a massive uplift in the amount of money put into young companies around the world, But when you look at it, and one of Alois's graphs very much showed it, when 40% of that was going just to one area called solar, clean energy very much hijacked the agenda. So we were looking at clean tech, but actually what we were looking at really was a huge investment surge into so-called clean energy. I don't think the third wave is going to be like that, and I'm going to try and sort of explain that sort of with 5 ideas of why I think we should be a bit more optimistic about what's coming up in the next few years. So just to briefly say a little bit about who we are and what perspective I am speaking from. I'm speaking from somebody who's not living it from a startup, who's not living it from an investor or a corporate point of view, but interacting with all of you, both by following the activities through our research, by consulting to some very significant corporates about their innovation programs, and indeed meeting you at our own events, and indeed fine events such as this. So that's my perspective, but market growth is my sort of first point. So people often, and we're guilty, look too much about the sort of investment activity, but actually miss the point that despite some of the problems that are going on, despite some of the pain, say, in an area like solar, essentially from a deployment point of view, i.e. goods being bought from people somewhere in the supply chain, this is an area that appears to be continually growing. There aren't huge reports on this, so I am drawing on the WWF annual report with Roland Berger, and their perspective is essentially that this area, this basket of goods and services is on a path to be as significant as some of the large established areas such as consumer electronics or the oil and gas world. So keep the deployment in mind. I think it's important that you are shooting for an industry that is actually in growth mode. The second thing to say is around services. You know, again, solar is a good story. Solar City is a good story. There are many others within that industry which are essentially making the point that whilst the technology end, if you were caught upstream, yep, you've suffered badly, but that doesn't mean that every company involved in the solar distribution chain is still suffering, is having a hard time. And I think services generally, actually, service businesses, people who are focused less on the technology and more on the deployment end. I'm using 2 examples here, Next Step Living from Boston and Nesco from the UK, who are essentially focused on delivering hardware and software and financing packages to customers to achieve the energy efficiency savings that they want, rather than developing sort of front-load technology. These are businesses that appear around the world to be doing pretty well. Then there are a new set of opportunities that are going to appear every 5, 10, 15 years. They're going to keep changing because the circumstances keep changing. I'm just going to pick on 3. I'm going to talk about conventional energy. I think this is a really important story. So yes, the whole energy scene has changed, as Alois mentioned about shale gas, for example, in the US. But that doesn't mean that so-called clean tech businesses that are offering the oil and gas industry improvements, resource efficiency improvements, even the right to operate in very tough environments, that doesn't mean they're not going to prosper during this period. I think actually the opposite. And our interaction with some of these names down the bottom says these guys are very worried about their future license to operate and need innovation to help them operate and go about their extractive industries. So a few basic examples, but just trying to think what goes on in this industry. So liquid robotics, this is a solar-powered unmanned vehicle at sea, helping them more efficiently find possible oil and gas reserves. Then in the drilling world, this is a laser technology, 4O Energy, that is there to try and be more precise than current technology and thereby creating this idea of doing more with less. GlassPoint, another use of solar, but this time it's using it in steam generators to help the oil and basically enhanced oil recovery, i.e. they get more out of their existing assets. And the last one is a water company, but it is basically helping the tar sands for all its problems and things we can argue about, but it is helping them because it is providing modular wastewater treatments in remote locations. I emphasized earlier on that I think this isn't all about energy. This is about a much broader set of resources when we're talking about doing more with less. I haven't got time to go into all of them. I guess I just want to make one point, which is in this investment ups and downs, there are always growers and there are fallers. And in this case, I'm just going to point out two, water and agriculture, just because they are different type of resources where actually investment into startups has been increasing. And then just within agriculture, wow, are there lots of different types of businesses to be looked at, but we haven't got time to go into them. I'm just going to give you two, partly to make a point about geography. So Tony's farm is basically what we would think of as an organic farm. It's not technologically an advancement or an innovation, but it's an innovation in the context of China, providing certified good food that plays to, I guess, the growing concerns about food safety. That is doing extremely well. And at the bottom, this is a business that is about measurement, measuring soil nutrients so that crop yields are enhanced. And finally, Jan touched on this earlier. I mean, I think it seems appropriate given we're in Berlin, and I'd understand there's a very strong sort of internet entrepreneurship community here to think about how the worlds of resources and information technology intersect. And they do so when we think about resource sharing, collaborative consumption, smart mobility, et cetera, et cetera. And it was very noticeable to us. Facebook came forward and asked whether we would help them with a competition to try and get entrepreneurs to leverage their billion-plus network in some environmentally positive fashion. So whether we're talking about carpooling here.com in Germany and ride sharing, or we're talking about Safara out of London, which is basically an energy efficiency software for architecture to design better buildings, or whether we're talking about peer-to-peer use of resources that are otherwise not being used, doing more with less, so apartments at the bottom in Airbnb's case, or relay rides and using cars that otherwise sit idle. These are all positive innovations to me. These are use of this term, this theme, Cleantech, and these are companies that appear on the face of it to be prospering, despite the fact that some people think Cleantech is history. So, fourth thing I'm going to touch on, which I do think is very significant, is around corporates and multinationals. I could have put lots of different logos here. My point is simply that sustainability and innovation are high priorities for a huge range of multinationals around the world. I think in a recent blog post, I called it, "Welcome to the biggest open innovation party the world's ever seen." So the point I want to make here is, yep, that's the easy thing to say, but what I actually also believe is this has only just begun. We've seen some names doing corporate venturing and active with startups for a few years, for sure, but I actually believe this has got a huge distance to run, and I call it, we are in the early majority. And my data points to try to prove that, or try to convince you that that might be so, is looking at our own data, firstly in M&A, or secondly where corporates are taking a minority investment in startups, is pretty much, we're still at the 50-50 point of view, where we are still getting, for every repeat corporate actor, we are getting a new one. And that suggests to me that we have a long way to run. And that's significant because not all these people are investing. And in fact, investing is actually a smaller part of the activity than creating partnerships. And yet partnerships, I think, are just as significant as money, albeit a startup might not quite agree with that idea. But I think actually, if you look at the way companies develop, the two are equally important. And partnerships are important, and I'm going to try and sort of give you that idea by using the metaphor of what went on in biotech over 25 years. You are looking at a picture, a representation of interfirm partnering, essentially partnering between young biotech companies and the big pharma, if you like. And what happened as that industry, if you want, as that innovation wave matured, and how it multiplied as they got more and more experienced and more results from doing so. And I guess whether I'm talking about the world of energy, automotive, food, retail, or anything else, this is what I'm expecting to happen, and hence why so-called clean tech companies in the third wave, I believe, will prosper as this interrelationship starts to get worked out. So I'm going to finish on China. So I think it's all important to have a geographical view of what's going on as well, and not sort of allow the fact that we sit in Europe in a macro economy that is clearly suffering, because there are lots of different markets. So at any point in time, you know, it matters who you are, where you are, what you're trying to do, and where you're trying to sell. So if I've got a cause for optimism, I mean, I think Alois said quite rightly that China is a place where cleantech is essentially at the heart of their industrial policy. And that's causing certain conditions that I think for certain types of cleantech companies, and this is where we're probably not going to be talking about lean startups, we're probably going to be talking about more capital-intensive startups. Because China actually has a need that is much greater than a lot of parts of the world, and certainly in Europe, certainly in the US, for certain types of technology that help clean up sort of heavy industry. And so one example here for me is a company called LanzaTech, which in 2010 was in this classic startup problematic phase where they needed to prove their waste-to-fuel technology, but couldn't get a demo plant going because they needed tens of millions to do so. So they end up going to China, they do a joint venture with Bao Steel, and within 2 years they've not only got this demo plant up and running, but they've actually finished it. So it's operated for a year, proved out beyond expectations what it is able to do, and that basically unleashes 2 or 3 things, ranging from more finance, suddenly people are willing to finance this, to the other steel companies in China are now also operating with this company, and thirdly, they have a partnership with Petronas in Malaysia, and essentially what China has done for this small little startup, because there is a need, it has accelerated its global growth plans. So if you are a company that has a need, that China has a need for, and haven't started to look at it seriously, I thoroughly encourage you to do so. So those are my 5 causes for optimism. I'm open for questions. I am, if Jan will allow me to plug, with the assistance of Nicolas from ID Invest, taking a tour to China again for the 3rd time. If any companies or investors with portfolio companies would like to join, come see me. Otherwise, thank you for having me. I hope that was interesting. I'm open for a question or 2. Thank you.
This was actually the best talk I ever heard from you, and I'm so grateful that you gave it at Ecosummit.